They live in a world where water turns to stone, and shorelines step outward with every winter that lasts for centuries. Glaciers thicken across high latitudes and mountain chains locking away enough ocean to lower global sea levels by more than 100 meters. Around 20,000 years ago, at the coldest reach of the last glacial maximum, the map of the continents changes shape. Familiar coasts recede to reveal new lands, broad shelves where grass and scrub spread over what will later be seafloor. Beringia rises between Siberia and Alaska as a windswept plain. In Europe, a low country, later called Doggerland, links Britain to the continent. In the tropics, the Sunda platform fuses mainland Southeast Asia with the islands of Sumatra, Borneo, and Java, while to the south, the Sahel Shelf joins Australia with New Guinea. In the southwest of Asia, the Persian Gulf basin lies exposed as a braided valley. Coastlines seeming fixed on human time breathe in Ice Age time. As ice thickens, the ocean lowers by roughly 120 meters, and the line where land meets sea marches outward. Bays become meadows, lagoons turn into lakes, and reef crests lift as pale platforms that step down into the lowered ocean. The newly exposed shelves are generous in some regions, hundreds of kilometers across, and narrow in others. They reshape access to resources and the routes between river mouths. People navigate this mosaic in stages moving between freshwater shelter and food learning, the reliable edges of a coastline that lies far from the one modern map's record. Rivers anchor this geography. They cut into frozen soils, sweep silt out across the shelves, and draw dependable lines of access in a seasonally harsh world. People follow them because they promise waterwood fish and a way back. Deltas advance outward, and the channels they build become winter roads when ice locks them, then summer lanes when thaw returns. Rivers also carry news embodied in objects that travel farther than their makers. A blade whose stone can be traced to a distant quarry, a lump of red ochre whose chemistry points to a well-known ridge, a shell bead whose origin lies beyond the horizon. Along these lines of movement, contact becomes more frequent, and with it, the quiet habit of exchange gifts to mark friendship parts traded for tools, pigments swapped for stories. Climate sets the tempo. Air holds less moisture in the cold storm, tracks shift, and dust rides the winds. Ice in both hemispheres locks away water so efficiently that atmospheric carbon dioxide rests near 180 to 190 parts per million, a number captured in tiny bubbles of ancient air inside polar ice. Lakes contract or migrate. Shorelines breathe with the ice. Forests retreat and steppe expands. The planetary circulation reorganizes, and with it the belts of rain and dryness swing. In some regions, coasts rich in kelp, shellfish, and driftwood become dependable larders. In others, exposure and distance limit settlement to short seasons. The same cold that closes passages in one place opens others elsewhere, and people learn these rhythms by moving within them. The evidence for this widened world comes in small, resilient forms. In southern Africa, ostrich eggshell beads show consistent diameters and drilling styles across broad regions during the late Pleistocene, a quiet sign of social links that persist when climates turn severe. Far from any beach, inland caves and rock shelters hold perforated marine shells shaped into ornaments some carried more than 100 kilometers from the sea. On the shelves themselves, fossil reef terraces register the low stand, like tide marks on stone, and sonar maps reveal drowned river valleys that extend outward from modern coasts in branching patterns. In the North Sea, fishers sometimes trawl peat antler and mammoth bone from the Doggerbank, reminders that these waters once held meadows and marsh. Each clue is modest, but together they outline a walkable world now drowned. People take advantage of the new breadth cautiously but persistently. Camps cluster near freshwater, where driftwood collects and fish run. Hearths appear in sequences that show return visits. Perhaps seasonal gatherings where groups exchange information as carefully as they swap goods. Ochre streaks on grindstones and caches of pigment nodules suggest planned use of color for skin binders, hides, and art. In many regions, the pigments match sources dozens of kilometers away. Preferred stone travels as finished blades and as unworked nodules, moving between groups along with recipes for shaping them. These are not markets in any later sense. They are relationships expressed through things maintained by visiting and by promise. Yet the pattern remains incomplete, and here mystery persists. Do people choose coasts and shelves because the literal favors survival, or because these margins act as highways that shorten distances between far-flung groups? Are the objects that move ochre shells favored stone tokens of alliance, or useful items that travel simply because families range widely with the seasons, when sea level falls by more than 100 meters? Many coasts extend tens to hundreds of kilometers. Some river mouths that stand far apart today lie within reach of a few days' walk. Did such compressions knit communities into continuous chains, or did they create scattered nodes that flicker with climate and chance? The archaeology speaks in fragments, and the ocean that later rises erases many answers. Still enough pieces surface to fix the frame. One consensus fact anchors the scene: global sea level during the last glacial maximum stands on the order of 120 meters below, present a change large enough to expose continental shelves on a planetary scale and to join landmasses that modern seas keep apart. A quieter, lesser-known detail waits in the ornament's inland burials that include marine shells and strings of ostrich eggshell beads, whose standardized size hints at shared norms across landscapes wider than many countries. A mystery remains beside them: whether the most important lines of travel run along coasts rich in kelp and shellfish, or along river corridors that braid across the shelves, and whether these lines form continuous networks or intermittent chains. Above all this, a planetary observation steadies the view as glaciers lock the oceans. Coastlines do not merely retreat, they shift by hundreds of kilometers, remaking the map of human possibility on a global canvas. In that canvas, exchange begins as a habit of meeting, and the first threads of trade take shape in small gifts passed hand to hand from one campfire to the next. Across the frozen landscapes of the last Ice Age, rivers carve steady paths that become both barriers and bridges, shifting with the seasons, yet always present as lines of orientation. In glacial summers, they run swollen with meltwater, carrying silt and stone from the ice toward the exposed continental shelves. In winters, they harden into frozen tracks, their surfaces solid enough for people and animals to cross with little effort. To groups moving through these regions, rivers are not merely features of geography. They are arteries of survival, places where fish gather in predictable cycles, where reeds grow for weaving, and where stones polished smooth by current can be worked into tools. They also act as corridors of memory. Generations return to the same bends, the same fords, and the same deltas that shift outward with each lowering of the sea. A world defined by glaciers is immense and often hostile, but rivers offer dependable guides. Some span continents: the Danube in Europe, the Ob, and Yenisei in Siberia, the Mississippi and Missouri across North America. Others run smaller but equally vital, linking inland basins to the distant coasts. When ice walls block the way, these waterways remain passable, carving through mountain ranges or tracing valleys where glaciers retreat. They provide routes through the cold steppe, through tundra, and through the scattered woodlands of a diminished world. Archaeological traces show how human groups cluster along them. Campsites recur in river terraces marked by hearths, flint debris, and bones cracked for marrow. Where rivers met the Ice Age seas, deltas formed fertile meeting grounds, rich in fish and waterfowl, supplying materials like reeds, clays, and pigments that traveled inland. Stone tool traditions, sometimes confined to a narrow source region, appear far downstream, carried not only in the hands of migrants, but likely through exchanges at seasonal gathering sites. In places like the Danube corridor, archaeologists see a succession of cultures layering along the banks, their artifacts showing continuity and contact across thousands of years. The rivers also shape myth and symbol, though these traces reach us only in fragments. Carved bones etched with flowing lines may echo currents. Painted caves stand near river valleys, their entrances facing toward floodplains where people camped. Shell ornaments appear in burials many kilometers from their origin, often placed in riverside graves, where water continued its silent motion past the dead. Rivers thus link both the living and the ancestral, carving out a geography of movement, memory, and meaning. Climate makes their role even more pronounced. During the last glacial, maximum rainfall patterns shift, deserts expand, and forests contract, but meltwater guarantees flow in some valleys even in the driest times. In Siberia and Alaska, braided rivers cut across the windswept plain of Beringia, joining continents that remain separated today. In Central Europe, ice sheets press southward, narrowing habitable zones into corridors where rivers form the only reliable guides. These watery highways connect groups otherwise isolated by ice walls, allowing exchanges of both genes and goods. Along them, blades of flint or chert travel, far from source quarries. Ochre nodules move between groups and symbolic carvings. Echo motifs seen thousands of kilometers apart. One detail illustrates the quiet power of rivers in structuring networks at sites in Central Europe. Beads carved from mammoth ivory have been found in layers associated with groups who may not have hunted mammoths themselves, but who lived along river systems that linked them to others who did. The objects traveled even when the animals did not, showing that rivers did not simply guide subsistence but also facilitated symbolic exchange. Yet much remains uncertain. Did groups deliberately set out to meet along these courses, anticipating gatherings where materials and ideas would circulate? Or did objects spread gradually through the slow drift of families moving season by season? Were rivers truly continuous highways, or were they chains of favored nodes where exchange occurred sporadically? Evidence is fragmentary, scattered by time and flood, often buried beneath later sediments. Many river valleys have changed course or drowned beneath rising seas at the end of the Ice Age, leaving archaeologists to work with partial glimpses. Still, consensus holds that these waterways structured the geography of contact more consistently than almost any other feature of the Ice Age world. On a planetary scale, the power of rivers during glacial times is immense. They drain ice sheets covering millions of square kilometers, carrying meltwater into oceans lowered by more than 100 meters. They build deltas far out on exposed shelves, sometimes dozens of kilometers from modern coasts. They serve as lines of continuity across regions otherwise transformed by permafrost dust storms and shifting climates. To humans navigating these landscapes, rivers compress immensity into something legible, a current to follow, a ford to cross, a place to meet. They are not yet trade routes in the later sense, but they are the first long corridors where goods, genes, and ideas move reliably across distance. From the bird's eye view of the planet, one sees these ribbons binding together habitats and peoples, turning a fractured Ice Age world into a connected one. Along the water's edge, people gather at dusk, tending fires whose smoke curls upward into the frozen air, exchanging not only food and tools, but also stories that travel as far as the rivers themselves. Here, the foundations of the earliest global exchange networks take form, quiet and enduring, shaped by currents that flow, whether or not humans walk beside them. As the rivers carve paths through the Ice Age world, another kind of current emerges, one made not of water, but of stone. Stone is everywhere, yet not all stone holds equal value. Some flints fracture with a predictable sharpness, producing long blades and fine points. Others crumble or splinter. In a time when survival depends on the precision of a cutting edge, the knowledge of where good stone lies and the willingness to move it far beyond its source become essential. Archaeologists trace this in the appearance of distinctive tool types and raw materials found hundreds of kilometers from their quarries. At certain sites in France and Central Europe, flints from well-known deposits appear in contexts far outside their geological range. In Africa, quartz jasper and chert circulate between valleys. In Siberia, obsidian from specific volcanic sources moves outward in widening arcs. These objects, unlike shell ornaments or pigments, carry practical as well as symbolic value, and their travel signals a growing interdependence between groups separated by long distances. Each stone tool is both a weapon and a story. A blade napped from a nodule carried over a mountain pass records not only the geology of its birthplace, but also the decisions of those who brought it. Was it exchanged directly as a gift between neighboring groups at a seasonal meeting place? Was it carried along a chain of kinship passed from family to family until it reached new lands? Or was it the result of people ranging far from home, extending their foraging territories to gather what others could not? The truth is likely a combination of all three, but the cumulative result is a network irregular, shifting yet persistent, that links distant landscapes through the medium of stone. One detail stands out in eastern Africa. Obsidian from the Rift Valley has been found over 200 kilometers from its source, a span, suggesting either deliberate transport or multiple exchanges across generations. Such distances, while modest by modern measure, represent vast journeys in Ice Age conditions, equivalent to traversing entire ecological zones and crossing the territories of multiple groups. The objects themselves endure as markers of these movements, silent witnesses to the first stirrings of trade. Alongside the functional blades and scrapers, symbolic uses emerge. Carefully shaped points too delicate for hunting caches of unused nodules, placed deliberately in the ground, and tools buried with the dead all indicate that stone holds meaning beyond utility. Its color, its sheen, its association with ancestral quarries all may have infused stone with symbolic weight. In some traditions, the act of giving such an object could cement alliance or mark identity, extending exchange beyond subsistence into the realm of culture. Still, questions linger. Do these widespread distributions reflect organized exchange, or simply the slow diffusion of materials as families move across the landscape? Could some stones have been transported incidentally, carried in bags or toolkits without intention to trade, only later deposited in new contexts? Are the most distant finds evidence of continuous contact or isolated anomalies left by rare, long journeys? The archaeological record cannot yet decide, leaving open the mystery of whether Ice Age stone networks were structured systems or loose meandering flows. Yet consensus rests on one fact: stone, from unique geological outcrops, traveled far beyond local ranges during the last Ice Age, marking one of the earliest signs of long-distance connection. Beyond the detail of obsidian from Africa or flint from Europe lies a planetary observation. As glaciers reshape the continents, they also redirect human movement in ways that promote such transfers. Ice sheets close off some routes, but open others, forcing people into corridors where encounters become more likely. In these choke points, the circulation of stone accelerates because people cannot avoid crossing paths. In the Danube corridor, for example, successive cultural horizons show a layering of tool traditions, each bearing traces of influences from both east and west, suggesting that this river valley acted as a funnel through which ideas and materials repeatedly passed. The spread of distinctive blade technologies across Eurasia further illustrates how innovations did not remain local but rippled outward along lines of contact, often tracked through the stone that carried them. To imagine this world is to see it stitched together by sparks struck from rock. Around campfires, people pass blades between them, demonstrating edge-making techniques, admiring the unusual gloss of a distant obsidian, or weighing a nodule in the hand before shaping it. The exchange may not be calculated, not yet trade in the structured sense, but it forms bonds of trust and recognition. A group receiving a tool from far away understands something of its giver's journey, and by accepting it, commits to a tie, however fragile. Over time, such exchanges accumulate, and the landscape becomes a web of remembered places and relationships. Stone is heavy, difficult to carry in bulk, yet the evidence shows it traveled anyway, chosen despite weight because of its importance. This persistence suggests that value lies not only in utility, but also in the connection embodied in the object. Each flake, each polished edge is a message from another place, proof of human presence in a distant valley, a tangible reminder that others exist beyond the horizon. The broader canvas reveals how these early exchanges sowed the seeds of networks that would later support more complex forms of trade. The objects are simple blades, cores, pigments, but the relationships they represent are enduring. In the scale of the Ice Age world, a flint blade carried across 200 kilometers is not merely a tool. It is the precursor of a rote, a thread in the growing fabric of connection that binds humanity even in its most scattered times. If stone moves as the first utilitarian thread across Ice Age landscapes, ochre travels as one of the earliest symbolic ones. The red mineral ground into powder and mixed with fat water, or plant juice, appears in camps and burials across continents, staining hides, marking bodies, and painting surfaces deep within caves. Its presence is both practical and expressive. Ochre repels, insects preserve skin, and acts as a binder for hide treatment, but it also colors rituals, artworks, and ornaments. What strikes archaeologists is not only the ubiquity of ochre, but its distance from origin. Nodules from specific quarries, recognizable by mineral composition, surface hundreds of kilometers away, carried by hands that valued more than utility. The spread of ochre becomes a quiet map of connections that extend farther than subsistence would require. At Blombos Cave in South Africa, ochre engraved with cross-hatch designs around 70,000 years ago speaks of symbolic intent. In European contexts, tens of thousands of years later, ochre marks burials, highlighting bones and tools placed with the dead. Across Asia and Australia, its use follows migrants as they adapt to new environments, carried with them as part of a symbolic toolkit. Some archaeological layers hold grindstones still stained with red caches of nodules, carefully stored, or mixing shells bearing residue. Each example demonstrates both the effort to acquire pigment and the decision to transport it often over rugged distances. One lesser-known detail underscores this in sites of interior Europe. Caches of ochre nodules have been found more than 100 kilometers from the nearest known deposits, showing that the mineral was not stumbled upon, but sought exchanged and treasured enough to carry far inland. The implications reach beyond color. They suggest that scattered groups shared a common understanding of ochre's importance, that pigment served as a bridge of meaning, linking people across ecological boundaries. When a group encountered others, the presentation of ochre may have carried weight equal to the giving of food or tools. Yet the full reasons remain uncertain. Did ochre travel primarily because of its practical benefits for hide processing, with symbolic uses emerging later? Or was its meaning already deeply embedded, making every transfer as much a statement of identity as of function? Could both be true, with pigment shifting fluidly between roles depending on context? The record does not allow certainty, leaving mystery and the red streaks that surface far from source. What is clear is that ochre is among the most widespread materials of Ice Age exchange, its presence stretching across continents and millennia. On the planetary scale, the role of ochre intersects with climate. As glaciers advance and retreat, vegetation zones shift, altering the availability of pigments. In some areas, river erosion exposes deposits, making them accessible. In others, ice buries them, forcing people to move or exchange. The expansion of steppe environments opens vast grazing grounds for animals, but reduces the diversity of plants, perhaps heightening the symbolic power of color as a rare and valued resource. Across thousands of kilometers, the persistence of red traces suggests that pigment was not abandoned even in times of scarcity, but carried forward as part of what it meant to be human. In this continuity lies one of the earliest indicators of shared symbolic culture, extending across landscapes reshaped by ice. The significance is amplified when we consider how these materials appear in ritual contexts. Burials with ochre-stained bones occur from southern Africa to Siberia, from Europe to the Americas. In some, bodies are fully coated. In others, only certain bones or tools are marked, suggesting diverse practices, but shared symbolism. The act of placing pigment with the dead implies that it was not merely a substance for survival, but a medium for connection to ancestors or to forces beyond the immediate world. In this, ochre becomes a universal language of color, understood across groups who may never have met, but who shared in the act of marking life with red. Archaeologists trace parallels between sites separated by oceans and ice, and though direct connections cannot always be proven, the resonance of the practice hints at deep, enduring links. The unresolved mystery remains how deliberate these networks were. Did pigment move as part of structured exchanges, perhaps passed at seasonal gatherings along river corridors or coastlines? Or did it travel through chains of kinship and mobility, with meaning diffusing gradually rather than through direct contact? The fragments we possess cannot reveal intent, yet the sheer distance traveled by some nodules demands recognition of a system, informal, flexible, but nevertheless persistent, that carried meaning through matter. One consensus fact underpins this section. Ochre use is found on every inhabited continent during the late Pleistocene, marking it as one of the most consistent elements of human symbolic behavior. A detail enriches the picture. Certain nodules from deposits in the Middle East have been identified in contexts hundreds of kilometers away, suggesting repeated and deliberate transport. The unresolved mystery circles back to intention, whether pigment was primarily functional or primarily symbolic, or whether it occupied a space that bridged both categories seamlessly. The planetary scale observation widens the view as glaciers advance and coastlines extend. Ochre networks stretch with them, forming lines of color across a pale and wind-scoured earth. In the twilight of camps scattered along rivers and shelves, red dust rises from grindstones, mixes with fat and stains skin that gleams in firelight. Across distances as vast as continents, groups share in this same act, making the Ice Age world a little smaller, a little more connected through the passage of a single color. Among the many objects that traveled across Ice Age landscapes, shell beads speak most clearly of long-distance movement. Unlike stone or ochre shells announce their origins with certainty, they come from the sea, and when found far inland, they signal journeys that extend far beyond daily foraging ranges. Archaeologists have uncovered perforated shells in sites located hundreds of kilometers from the nearest coast, their surfaces smoothed and shaped by human hands into ornaments that once hung from cords or clothing. The presence of these beads tells a layered story. They carry no practical value for hunting or survival, yet they appear again and again in contexts that suggest social meaning: burials, ritual deposits, and adornments worn in life. Their very distance from the shore adds to their significance, for to hold such a bead is to hold proof of a journey or a connection to others who live in different environments. In caves of southern Europe, for example, shells from Mediterranean coasts appear deep inland, placed beside the bones of individuals who never saw the sea. In African contexts, Nassarius shells have been found far from any beach, suggesting networks that reached across deserts and savannas. In Asia and Australia, shell ornaments accompany burials that lie far from the coastlines of the time, evidence that they were carried or exchanged across broad stretches of land. These beads, small enough to travel easily, yet meaningful enough to treasure, may have served as tokens of alliance, markers of identity, or gifts exchanged to strengthen ties between groups. One lesser-known detail illustrates this: at certain European sites, strings of shell beads have been found in consistent numbers and sizes, as though communities shared conventions about how ornaments should be made and worn. This points to more than random collection. It suggests systems of shared style, perhaps even early standards of symbolic value that crossed group boundaries. The mystery lies in how deliberate these movements were. Were shells carried inland by individuals who traveled themselves to the sea, perhaps during seasonal migrations that reached coastal zones? Or did they pass hand to hand, moving gradually along chains of contact until they arrived in places where the ocean was only a story? Were they exchanged at meetings beside rivers and deltas, where inland and coastal groups gathered to swap goods, stories, and partners? Archaeologists cannot yet answer with certainty. But the repeated presence of marine shells far from coasts insists that some form of organized transfer occurred. These ornaments matter because they transform objects of nature into symbols of connection. To wear a shell in the Ice Age interior was to signal a link to distant landscapes, to embody a connection to people unseen. Shells by their origin also suggest cycles and horizons: the sea, a realm that changes with tides and seasons, and the shore where land and water meet. In carrying pieces of this boundary, inland people brought a fragment of one world into another. This act may have bound together groups living in different ecological zones, uniting them through shared symbols, even when separated by mountains, ice, or steppe. On a planetary scale, the spread of shell beads mirrors the expansion of coastlines during the last glacial maximum. As sea level fell by more than 100 meters, continental shelves stretched outward, exposing beaches rich with shells and marine life. These new coastal landscapes, abundant with resources, became gathering places where groups lingered. From there, shells could begin their journeys inland, carried with hunters returning to river valleys, or traded outward to groups who provided meat hides or stone in return. In this way, the expansion of the coastlines amplified opportunities for exchange, turning marine ornaments into some of the most traveled objects of the Ice Age world. Archaeologists agree on one consensus fact: perforated shells are among the earliest widespread ornaments in human history, appearing on multiple continents and often found far from their coastal sources. This suggests that symbolic exchange through ornaments was a nearly universal practice among late Pleistocene humans. The lesser-known detail lies in the standardization of certain bead types, implying that groups did not merely collect shells individually, but participated in shared traditions of ornament making. The unresolved mystery persists in how these objects moved, whether through direct travel, through chains of kinship exchange, or through gatherings that served as proto-markets where goods and meanings converged. What is certain is that shell beads highlight the symbolic dimension of the earliest exchange networks, turning distant coastlines into touchstones of identity for communities far from the sea. In the stillness of an Ice Age camp, deep in a valley where the sea cannot be seen or heard, a small shell glimmers in the firelight, pierced and threaded, carrying within it the memory of waves. Where ice spread thick across continents, it left only narrow ribbons of land free for movement, and these glacial corridors became both obstacles and meeting points. During the last glacial maximum, much of northern Europe and North America lay under kilometers of ice, while Asia bore its own shield of frozen mass across the Siberian plains. Between these icy expanses, however, stretch passages where tundra and steppe offered space to move, hunt, and gather. Such ice-free zones drew scattered groups into closer proximity, compressing human life into limited routes where encounters became inevitable. The Danube Corridor is one of the best studied examples. Flowing from the Black Forest to the Black Sea, it traced a line along which multiple human cultures overlapped. Archaeological layers along its banks reveal a succession of tool types and symbolic artifacts that blend influences from east and west, suggesting that groups met and mingled in this narrow passageway. To the north lay impassable glaciers, to the south, mountains and drier basins. But along the river valley, life endured and exchange flourished. Similar dynamics shaped the movement across Asia, where the Altai Mountains and surrounding valleys acted as crossroads. In caves and open-air sites, their archaeologists have found artifacts that blend traits from both Western Eurasia and East Asia. DNA evidence adds weight to this, revealing that humans who passed through these zones carried genetic signals of interbreeding with Denisovans, a branch of ancient humans whose presence further underscores the role of mountain corridors as meeting grounds. These encounters were not only biological, but also cultural, as tool types and ornaments demonstrate threads of shared practice across vast distances. In North America, later phases of the Ice Age saw the opening of an interior corridor between the Laurentide and Cordilleran ice sheets. While debates continue about exactly when this passage became viable for humans moving southward, the principle remains: corridors opened by retreating ice-shaped migration and contact. Where narrow valleys permitted passage, people converged, sometimes passing through, sometimes staying, always leaving traces of interaction. One lesser-known detail sharpens the picture in Central Asia sites along glacial margins. Preserve ornaments made of mammoth ivory carried between groups that otherwise show different tool traditions. These objects likely functioned as tokens of contact, exchange in narrow corridors where populations overlapped. The pattern is repeated elsewhere in the form of symbolic motifs etched into bone or stone, appearing in regions far apart, but linked by these roots. The unresolved mystery lies in how intentional these meetings were. Did groups deliberately converge at predictable points knowing that others would also arrive, or were encounters more accidental, the result of constrained movement through valleys where avoidance was impossible? Did the exchange of goods and genes emerge from cooperation or from tension diffused by the giving of gifts? Archaeology leaves these questions open, but the repeated presence of blended traditions along glacial margins suggests that contact was not rare. Climate-forced proximity and proximity fostered exchange. On the planetary scale, the pattern is stark. Ice sheets covered nearly one-third of the Earth's land surface, but their very presence created edge zones where life compressed. These margins acted like funnels, narrowing the vastness of continents into points of contact. Just as rivers provided lines of movement, glacial corridors became gates few in number, but immense in influence. They were the bottlenecks through which technology's ornaments and genes passed, ensuring that even in a fragmented and frozen world, humanity did not drift into isolation. A consensus fact underlines this: archaeological and genetic evidence shows that populations once separated by distance met in glacial corridors, leaving signatures of both cultural blending and interbreeding. A lesser-known detail adds texture: the mammoth ivory ornaments of Central Asia, found in contexts that suggest they were exchanged between culturally distinct groups. The unresolved mystery persists in the question of intent. Were these gatherings sought out as opportunities for exchange, or were they the unavoidable consequence of ice narrowing the paths of movement? The planetary observation broadens the frame. Ice did not only divide the continents, it also created the junctions where scattered groups encountered one another, binding the human story together in places where glaciers receded just enough to let life pass. To imagine these crossroads is to picture narrow valleys edged by towering ice walls, where smoke from campfires drifts upward into the cold air. Groups gather wary at first, then sharing food tools and pigments. Objects pass from hand to hand, carrying memory and meaning. These are not yet structured markets, but they are the beginnings of threads woven in constrained landscapes, the earliest nodes of what will in time expand into networks that circle the globe. In the dark interiors of caves scattered across Ice Age landscapes, humans left marks that reveal something of their shared imagination. These painted walls and carved surfaces do not stand as isolated expressions, Many motifs recur across regions, hinting at symbolic connections that stretch far beyond any single valley. Animals stride across rock faces in France, Spain, and Indonesia, separated by continents yet united in form and theme. Abstract signs cross hatches dots. Hand stencils appear in caves as far apart as Africa, Europe, and Asia. Such echoes suggest that communication was not confined to spoken language or immediate exchange, but also traveled through symbols that resonated across distance. Archaeologists puzzle over how these similarities arose. Did motifs spread gradually as people moved along rivers and coastlines, carrying with them a shared vocabulary of signs? Or did human groups faced with similar challenges and imaginations independently converge on related forms? The evidence leaves space for both interpretations, but the persistence of certain designs over thousands of years and vast regions suggests that contact and transmission played a role. Symbolic objects themselves sometimes traveled alongside the ideas. Carved bone plaques bearing abstract motifs appear in contexts far from where their raw materials were obtained. Portable art figurines of ivory, decorated tools, and engraved stones could be carried from camp to camp, exchanged between groups and left behind in caves that became meeting places. One lesser-known detail illustrates this in sites along the Swabian Jura in Germany. Figurines of animals and hybrid beings carved from mammoth ivory appear in clusters that suggest gatherings where symbolic objects were displayed and perhaps traded. Similar objects surface in regions thousands of kilometers away, bearing stylistic echoes that hint at connections along glacial corridors and rivers. The caves themselves may have acted as nodal points in these symbolic networks. Many are located near rivers or in valleys that served as travel corridors, making them natural places for groups to pause. Their walls became canvases not only for the inhabitants of a single group, but perhaps for successive visitors who added to existing imagery. Layers of painting, engraving, and carving suggest long-term use, sometimes spanning centuries, during which symbols accumulated like voices in dialogue. The unresolved mystery lies in whether these caves were intended as shared spaces of communication, repositories of symbols accessible to all who passed, or whether the repeated motifs reflect independent traditions that coincidentally aligned. Archaeologists debate whether similarities between continents demonstrate contact or parallel invention, yet the possibility of connection remains compelling, especially when combined with evidence of object movement across long distances. On the planetary scale, the role of these symbols is striking. As glaciers reshaped the Earth and coastlines expanded outward, humans carried with them a capacity for abstract thought and symbolic expression that transcended ecological boundaries. The recurrence of motifs across continents implies that symbolic systems may have functioned as a kind of long-distance language, an intangible network layered atop the physical roots of rivers and corridors. Even when seas and ice separated groups, the persistence of shared symbols suggests an enduring common ground. A consensus fact anchors this reflection. Symbolic art and portable ornaments are found across multiple continents during the late Pleistocene, demonstrating that abstract expression was not confined to a single region, but was a widespread feature of early human culture. The lesser-known detail enriches it: the mammoth ivory figurines of the Swabian Jura, some depicting composite creatures, cluster in a way that implies communal display and exchange, rather than isolated creation. The unresolved mystery endures whether the recurrence of motifs across distant regions results from direct contact or independent invention, shaped by similar cognitive capacities and environments. The planetary observation ties it together across continents and millennia. Humans inscribed a shared symbolic layer onto the Ice Age world, leaving behind echoes of meaning that connect even when geography divides. In the flicker of firelight against cave walls and the careful carving of ivory and bone, people found ways to project their inner worlds outward, and in doing so, they created threads of connection that stretched farther than the reach of their voices. When the ice locked away so much of the world's water, the coastlines of continents shifted outward, revealing vast shelves that became new corridors for human movement. What had once been seabed turned into plains of grass and scrub, rich with game and edged by beaches abundant in shellfish. These landscapes, temporary in geological time, but enduring for thousands of years, offered both sustenance and pathways. For people living along them, the coast became not a limit, but a highway, a line of connection, linking distant groups through a chain of refuges. Archaeologists today see only fragments of this world, for most of these shelves lie beneath modern seas, their evidence hidden under layers of sediment. Yet, scattered clues survive. Sonar mapping reveals drowned river valleys branching outward from present coasts, their channels once lined with camps and seasonal settlements. Fishing weights and net fragments found inland hint at traditions that may have originated on now submerged shores. Shell middens preserved along higher ground suggest that humans exploited the coastal abundance intensively. The pattern points to a way of life centered on marine margins where people could move efficiently along hundreds of kilometers, carrying with them not only food, but also ideas and objects. The Sunda Shelf of Southeast Asia offers a vivid example. When sea levels fell, Sumatra, Java, Borneo, and the mainland fused into a vast landmass. Rivers braided across this exposed platform, linking coasts that today lie separated by seas. Archaeological finds show evidence of human presence across this expanse, suggesting that people treated the shelf as a connected landscape. From there, movement extended southward into Sahel, the joined continent of Australia, and New Guinea, marking one of humanity's earliest long-distance migrations. Similar patterns likely occurred elsewhere in Europe. Doggerland stretched between Britain and the continent. In the Persian Gulf, basin rivers carved through a fertile plain that may have supported dense human life. In the Americas, the now drowned coastal shelves of the Pacific offered rich kelp forests and stable resources. One lesser-known detail underscores the importance of these coasts. Beads made from marine shells in interior Europe date to periods when the North Sea shelf was exposed, suggesting that the ornaments may have originated in communities living on land now submerged. Such finds hint at entire cultural zones erased by the rising seas at the end of the Ice Age, leaving only indirect traces and inland artifacts. The unresolved mystery is whether people deliberately followed coastlines as structured routes, aware that they offered predictable resources and connections, or whether movement was more opportunistic, guided by immediate needs rather than long-term planning. The possibility that humans navigated extensive distances along these shelves, effectively creating maritime corridors before the age of boats, remains a subject of debate. What is certain is that coastlines offered stability in an unstable world. Even when climates shifted inland, the shore continued to provide fish, shellfish, seaweed, and driftwood. On the planetary scale, the lowering of the seas by more than 100 meters exposed nearly 8% of the Earth's surface anew, reshaping the geography of human existence. Whole regions now invisible beneath waves once stood as vast plains alive with people, animals, and networks of exchange. To imagine this is to see the continents swollen outward, their edges extended into broad steps where rivers met the sea. Along these lines, people could walk from one ecological zone to another, encountering groups whose traditions echoed their own. Archaeologists hold a consensus fact. During the last glacial maximum, global sea levels stood roughly 120 meters lower than today, exposing continental shelves that dramatically expanded habitable land. A detail adds richness in the Persian Gulf Basin sediment cores, reveal ancient river systems that would have supported freshwater and fertile soils, suggesting that this drowned plain may once have been a hub of human life and exchange. The unresolved mystery remains to what extent did humans rely on these coastlines as deliberate highways, and how much evidence of their lives now lies hidden under the sea, unrecoverable, except through rare geological windows. Yet, even without full answers, the scale is clear. As humans stood on these ancient shores, they looked out across horizons farther than they could see, and they walked along beaches that no longer exist, leaving behind beads, tools, and traces that traveled inland. In the hush of an Ice Age dawn, with mist rising from rivers that cut through the shelves, groups gathered where land met water, exchanging shells, pigments, and stories. Their pathways traced the outline of continents that modern maps cannot show, coastlines that carried people into encounters and exchanges that would shape the first global networks. Beyond the movement of stones, shells, and pigments, there is a quieter but no less powerful record of contact that rests in the human body itself. Ancient DNA preserved in bones and teeth across continents has revealed that the last ice age was not an era of isolation, but of connection even across landscapes divided by glaciers. Genetic evidence shows that groups once thought to be separate encountered one another interbred and left lasting traces in populations that survive today. These genetic echoes speak of meetings that archaeology alone cannot always reveal. In Siberia, genomes extracted from Ice Age remains show a blend of ancestries combining signals from Western Eurasia with those from the East. Such findings suggest that the corridors through the Altai and other regions were not just routes of tool exchange, but places where people themselves mixed. Some individuals carry traces of Denisovan DNA evidence of encounters with a population that once lived in caves scattered across Asia. These fragments persist in the genomes of modern peoples, especially in Oceania and parts of Asia, long after the Denisovans themselves disappeared. They serve as a genetic memory of meetings in valleys and corridors tens of thousands of years ago. In Europe, DNA shows repeated mixing between groups that once carried distinct tool traditions, reminding us that cultural boundaries did not always align with biological ones. In the Americas, early genomes reveal links to both Siberia and East Asia, reflecting the crossings that brought people into a new continent. One lesser-known detail illustrates the reach of these connections. In remains from the Lake Baikal region, individuals show a surprising mix of ancestries, suggesting that this interior basin was a hub where multiple populations met, perhaps drawn by rich fishing grounds and strategic routes. Such genetic mosaics highlight the role of lakes and river valleys as gathering points where goods and genes alike could move. The unresolved mystery lies in the nature of these meetings. Were they rare fleeting encounters between small groups passing through the same corridors, or were they more sustained with alliances, intermarriage, and repeated contact shaping communities over centuries? Did interbreeding occur mainly through cooperative ties, or did it result from conflict and capture? The DNA cannot yet answer intent, only presence, leaving archaeologists and geneticists to piece together stories from fragments of bone. On the planetary scale, the evidence underscores how, even in the coldest depths of the Ice Age, humans remained part of a global story of connection. Glaciers covered immense territories, but within the ice-free zones, groups found ways to meet, mix, and move. The result is a web of ancestry that stretches across continents, binding together people who may never have known the full extent of the networks they formed. This web is not smooth or uniform. It is patchy, full of gaps, reflecting the irregularity of encounters. Yet, even in its incompleteness, it demonstrates that the Ice Age world was interconnected. Archaeologists hold a consensus fact. Genetic studies confirm that populations during the last Ice Age were not isolated, but showed repeated evidence of contact and admixture across regions. The detail adds depth. The Lake Baikal remains carrying unexpected genetic combinations, point to interior hubs of connection beyond the better-known coastal routes. The unresolved mystery remains. What social dynamics underlay these genetic signals were they the result of structured alliances, opportunistic encounters, or accidents of survival in shared landscapes? The planetary observation widens the view. The legacy of Ice Age contact endures in the DNA of billions alive today, carrying forward fragments of meetings in corridors, lakesides, and caves long since vanished beneath forests, fields, and seas. To picture this world is to imagine fires burning along the margins of ice, where strangers met and gradually became kin. Across generations, these meetings stitched together ancestries as surely as tools and ornaments stitched together cultures. The echoes remain in living bodies, reminders that the Ice Age was not only an age of hardship, but also one of connection, where the first global networks were written into both matter and memory. When night fell across the Ice Age landscapes, firelight became the constant around which people gathered. Small bands set their hearths near rivers and caves, or on the wind-sheltered slopes of valleys. The flicker of flame did more than provide warmth. It created temporary spaces of community where objects, skills, and stories were exchanged. Archaeologists often find concentrations of hearths clustered together, ash and charcoal staining the ground, in circles that suggest gatherings larger than a single family. In such places, goods from distant sources appear, side by side, flints from one valley, ochre from another, shells that must have traveled from coasts unseen. The firelight reveals the texture of early exchange not as structured trade routes, but as recurring meetings where people paused in their movements and shared. The circulation of objects here is inseparable from the circulation of stories. Around the flames, elders instructed the young in tool-making and reading the stars, in remembering pathways through forests and tundra. Visitors arriving from afar contributed their knowledge too, carrying news of distant herds, climate shifts, or encounters with other groups. These gatherings were as much about information as about goods, and the two became intertwined. A piece of flint might be given not simply as a tool, but as proof of the place from which it came, anchoring a story of travel and encounter. One lesser-known detail survives in the arrangement of hearths at certain European sites. At Dolní Věstonice in the Czech Republic, archaeologists uncovered multiple fireplaces within a shared space, their placement suggesting coordinated use. Among the ash lay fragments of figurines, pigments, and tools from distant sources. The site likely functioned as a meeting ground where groups came together seasonally. The hearths themselves became nodes of exchange, their light drawing people and goods into a shared circle. Yet mysteries remain. Were such gatherings planned, with groups traveling deliberately to meet at certain times of year? Or were they more opportunistic, arising when hunting parties' paths happened to converge? Were the goods exchanged seen as gifts that bound relationships, or as trades balanced by expectation of return? The archaeology cannot resolve intention, but the repeated clustering of hearths, the mixing of artifacts, and the evidence of communal activity all suggest that firelight provided the stage for early networks to take shape. On the planetary scale, the role of fire in sustaining exchange cannot be overstated. Glaciers lowered temperatures by several degrees. Globally, winters stretched long, and nights were bitter. Fire was survival, but it was also visibility. Its glow signaled presence across dark landscapes, drawing travelers toward companionship. In a world vast and often empty, the sight of a distant fire may have been the first sign that others were near, offering both risk and opportunity. To approach was to risk confrontation, but also to gain connection. Thus, firelight structured not only the rhythms of daily life, but also the geography of contact. A consensus fact anchors this reflection. Archaeological sites from the Ice Age consistently show clustered hearths, often associated with artifacts of distant origin, indicating that gatherings occurred where exchange took place. A detail deepens it at Dolní Věstonice. Not only hearths, but also kilns have been discovered among the earliest known examples of ceramic use, suggesting that gatherings by fire also became sites of innovation and symbolic creation. The unresolved mystery persists in the social meaning of these exchanges. Were they driven by necessity, by ritual, by alliance, or by the unpredictable mixture of all three? What we know is that firelight was the medium through which they occurred. On a planetary scale, the glow of countless campfires across continents marks the nodes of the first global networks, small lights scattered against the immensity of ice and darkness. To picture this world is to see not lines on a map, but points of warmth across the land, each one a temporary hub where goods, genes, and stories converged. The flames fade by morning, leaving only ash, but the connections endure, carried onward by those who rise, shoulder their tools, and walk toward the next horizon. As the Ice Age drew toward its close, the glaciers began to retreat. The colossal walls of ice that had stood immovable for millennia melted into torrents of water, carving new channels, swelling rivers, and raising seas. In this transition lay one of the great erasures of human history. Many of the pathways and settlements that had flourished on the exposed continental shelves and low-lying valleys disappeared beneath rising oceans. The archaeological record that remains is therefore incomplete, its gaps shaped as much by geological forces as by human choice. Beneath today's North Sea lies Doggerland, once a vast plain linking Britain to continental Europe. Peat, antler, and bone, dredged up by fishing nets, hint at rivers, forests, and marshes where people lived, hunted, and gathered. The traces are tantalizing hearths and campsites, ornaments, and tools, all now drowned. Similarly, the Persian Gulf basin once lay exposed, its braided river systems sustaining fertile plains that may have hosted dense human life. Sediment cores reveal pollen from plants no longer found in that drowned valley, testifying to its once rich ecology. The Sunda and Sahul shelves, now hidden under tropical seas, supported migrations that carried humans deep into Australasia. All of these landscapes, crucial in their time, vanished underwater, leaving only fragments as evidence. One lesser-known detail brings the magnitude of this loss into focus. Sonar mapping of the Sunda Shelf has revealed submerged river valleys extending hundreds of kilometers from modern coasts, complete with terraces and floodplains where people likely lived. These drowned valleys mirror the great rivers inland, yet their archaeological record is almost entirely inaccessible, lying under layers of sediment and sea. The unresolved mystery is how much of early human exchange took place along these now hidden coasts. Were the first sustained networks built not in the interiors we can excavate, but in places now unreachable where coastal groups gathered seasonally, exchanging shells, pigments, and stone? Did the rhythm of tides and fishing grounds structure the earliest long-distance meetings, their evidence now erased? Archaeologists can only infer, piecing together hints from inland ornaments and genetic signals that point back to drowned lands. On the planetary scale, the scale of inundation is immense. As the climate warmed and ice melted, sea levels rose by more than 100 meters, swallowing nearly 8 million square kilometers of land. The coastlines humans had known for thousands of years shifted inward sometimes by hundreds of kilometers. Valleys became bays, plains became seas, and entire cultural landscapes were erased. This global flooding, gradual on the scale of a lifetime, but rapid on geological timescales, reshaped not only habitats, but also memory. What had once been the center of life became unreachable, a horizon over water. A consensus fact anchors this reflection. Sea level rose by roughly 120 meters between the last glacial maximum and the mid-Holocene, drowning the continental shelves where Ice Age humans once lived. A detail sharpens the view. Submerged river systems on the Sunda Shelf retain forms so well preserved that geologists can still trace their channels, suggesting that extensive human settlement once followed their courses. The unresolved mystery lingers: how many artifacts, ornaments, and stories now rest under the sea? And to what extent did those drowned landscapes serve as the primary arenas of the first human exchange networks? The planetary observation broadens the frame. The rising seas not only erased land, but also scattered people, forcing them inland, reshaping networks and pushing groups into new encounters. The loss of coastal hubs may have driven innovation elsewhere, compelling humans to re-establish contacts along rivers and mountain corridors as the seas rose. To imagine these vanished places is to picture plains now silent beneath waves, hearths extinguished, paths, submerged ornaments lying in silt. The people who once walked there carried fragments, inland shells strung as beads, pigments in small nodules, stone from distant quarries. These survivors of drowned worlds remind us that much of the first global trade is invisible, hidden under oceans that conceal its traces. Yet its influence endures, woven into the fabric of inland sites, genetic signals, and cultural echoes that still speak of networks once strung across lands the sea has taken. Exchange during the Ice Age was not limited to ornaments and pigments. It also extended to the very means of survival. When groups met in corridors at coasts or beside rivers, they did not only share shells or stone blades, but also passed on techniques, ways of making, preserving, or enduring that could mean the difference between life and death. These technologies, spreading across landscapes, acted as a form of trade more profound than objects alone. Tailored clothing is one example. In climates where winter temperatures dropped far below freezing, loose hides were insufficient. Archaeological finds of eyed bone needles, some dating back more than 20,000 years, reveal that people stitched garments fitted closely to the body, layering furs and hides for warmth. The appearance of such tools in sites far from their origin suggests that the knowledge of sewing spread between groups. A community that mastered tailoring could pass on not only needles, but also the method of cutting and stitching, ensuring survival in harsher zones. Fishing techniques provide another case. Net fragments, weights, and carved hooks found in diverse regions suggest a circulation of aquatic skills. Lakes and rivers rich in fish became gathering places where knowledge was exchanged along with food. The spread of similar tool types across continents implies that when groups met, they absorbed not only artifacts, but also methods. Fire management shows similar diffusion. Evidence of controlled hearths organized into patterns for warmth and cooking points to shared strategies. Some sites reveal stones placed around fire pits to regulate heat, while others show arrangements suggesting collective cooking. These ideas likely traveled as families encountered one another and observed practices worth imitating. One lesser-known detail illustrates this dynamic. Residues on grinding stones from Ice Age Siberia show traces of plant processing, including grasses and roots, long before agriculture emerged. The presence of similar traces in far-off regions suggests that groups exchanged knowledge of which plants could be safely consumed and how to prepare them. What might seem minor innovations, grinding, soaking, fermenting, could expand diets and stabilize survival in times of scarcity. The unresolved mystery lies in how structured this knowledge transfer was. Did groups actively teach one another, perhaps during gatherings? Or did knowledge diffuse through observation when visitors saw tools in use? Were certain individuals, perhaps skilled tool makers or healers, carriers of specialized knowledge who traveled more widely, acting as conduits of ideas? Archaeologists can only speculate as techniques leave subtler traces than ornaments. But the repeated appearance of similar technologies in distant regions argues for some form of contact-driven exchange. On the planetary scale, these shared techniques show how survival in the Ice Age was a collective achievement shaped not only by environment, but by interconnection. Even when glaciers divided continents, the diffusion of knowledge linked them indirectly, ensuring that ideas traveled farther than any single person might walk. A consensus fact underscores this. Bone needles with eyes crucial for tailored clothing appear across Eurasia during the last glacial maximum, enabling humans to thrive in environments previously considered uninhabitable. A detail deepens the picture. The plant residues on Siberian grinding stones echoed in distant regions suggest that knowledge of plant processing traveled alongside material culture. The unresolved mystery endures whether such knowledge spread deliberately through teaching or indirectly through imitation, and whether specialized individuals acted as mediators in this process. The planetary observation widens the perspective in the scale of Ice Age survival. The diffusion of techniques transformed human capacity, binding scattered groups into a species-wide collaboration that spanned continents. To imagine this is to see families gathered by fire, exchanging more than goods. One shows another how to shape a needle, another demonstrates the weaving of a net, another explains which roots to boil. Each lesson carried onward multiplies, embedding itself in future generations. These exchanges, humble and practical, represent perhaps the deepest form of trade, one where survival itself becomes the shared commodity. The earliest exchanges were bound to gestures of generosity and gift, but over time the repetition of meetings began to shape something more structured. Objects once given freely to affirm alliance or kinship started to travel along predictable paths, moving in patterns that suggest the beginnings of trade routes. In Ice Age contexts, archaeologists see this in the distribution of certain raw materials that appear not randomly, but in steady gradients across landscapes. Flint, obsidian, and ochre sometimes radiate outward from their sources in ways that imply repeated transfer between adjacent groups. Shell beads, too, appear at regular intervals inland, as though each community passed a portion along. This rhythm is not yet commerce in the later sense. No evidence points to fixed markets or calculated exchange rates. Instead, it seems that gift-giving gradually created expectations. If one group received obsidian, another might provide shells or hides in return. And over time, these transactions formed lines of reciprocity that stretched across vast distances. One lesser-known detail illustrates this shift in parts of Europe. Archaeologists have found caches of unworked stone nodules buried far from quarries, as if communities stored supplies not only for themselves, but for future exchange. The act of moving stone in bulk suggests planning and awareness that others would value the material and that its transfer could strengthen ties. Similar hints appear in strings of beads prepared in advance, perhaps intended for distribution, rather than solely personal use. These patterns suggest a step beyond spontaneous gift-giving toward deliberate provisioning for networks of contact. The unresolved mystery lies in intent. Did groups recognize that they were laying down pathways of trade? Or did these roots emerge unconsciously, the byproduct of repeated generosity and obligation? Were objects valued for their intrinsic qualities or for the social bonds they created when given? Archaeology cannot yet tell, for artifacts speak of movement, but not of motive. Still, the growing regularity of distribution implies that people began to anticipate exchange, shaping their movements to align with it. On the planetary scale, this development marks a transformation in how humans related to landscapes. No longer were valleys and corridors merely places to pass through. They became parts of a mental map of connection marked by the memory of past exchanges and the expectation of future ones. In this way, geography itself was reimagined as a web of relationships, not only a set of resources. A consensus fact anchors the reflection material, culture, from the Ice Age often appears in gradients radiating from specific sources, indicating repeated transfer rather than isolated transport. A detail sharpens it. The caches of unworked nodules found in interior regions, stored seemingly for later exchange, reveal planning and foresight. The unresolved mystery remains: did people at the time perceive these exchanges as structured trade, or did they simply act within a system of gifts that only in hindsight appears as the seed of commerce? The planetary observation expands the frame. In the repetition of giving and receiving, networks became more than chance. They grew into predictable threads that connected human groups across continents. To picture this world is to imagine pathways not marked by roads, but by memory, by the knowledge that at the next river, bend, or sheltered valley, others would gather and objects would change hands. Around firelight, groups prepared materials not only for themselves, but for their partners in distant camps. In this slow rhythm of generosity and expectation, gifts became pathways, and pathways became the first faint outlines of trade. As the Ice Age waned and climates warmed, the networks that had formed in valleys, along rivers, and on coastlines began to stretch farther. Glaciers retreated, exposing new lands and fertile plains, and humans followed, carrying with them both the memory and practice of exchange. Where once corridors through ice had compressed people into narrow channels, the thaw opened broad routes across grasslands and valleys. Populations grew, encounters multiplied, and the flow of goods and ideas expanded into webs that foreshadowed the later systems of trade that would shape civilizations. Archaeological evidence shows how cultural traditions that once remained localized began to spread widely. Distinctive tool types radiated across regions, appearing in areas far from their first innovation. Ornament styles, too, traveled, suggesting that symbolic expression no longer stopped at local boundaries. Genetic evidence complements this, showing renewed mixing between groups once separated by ice, as warming climates enabled longer journeys and more sustained contacts. In fertile zones like the Levant, the Danube Basin, and the Great Valleys of China, groups began to settle more permanently, creating stable hubs where exchange could be concentrated. These places became not just meeting points, but semi-permanent centers anchoring the web of connections. One lesser-known detail illustrates the expanding scope in the Fertile Crescent. Obsidian, from sources in Anatolia, appears at sites hundreds of kilometers away, showing that even before agriculture, people were moving or exchanging volcanic glass over considerable distances. The consistency of its appearance implies more than chance movement. It suggests established pathways along which goods traveled. Similar patterns emerge in Europe, where amber, prized for its color, and sheen, began to move southward from northern coasts. The unresolved mystery lies in how organized these networks had become. Were there individuals who specialized in carrying goods between groups, anticipating demand and building reputation, or did exchange remain embedded in social rituals, a byproduct of meetings whose primary purpose was alliance and storytelling? Archaeology reveals the movement, but not the role of the people who moved it. Yet the spread of materials along consistent routes suggests an emerging predictability, perhaps the earliest glimmer of traders whose identities were tied to mobility. On the planetary scale, the warming climates that ended the Ice Age catalyzed this expansion. As glaciers retreated, forests spread into regions. Once barren rivers carved new courses, and coastlines shifted inward as seas rose. Humans adapted by extending their networks into these transformed landscapes, carrying forward the practices honed during millennia of survival under ice. The New World was less constrained but more populous, making networks more essential. A consensus fact anchors this view. By the late Pleistocene and early Holocene, materials, such as obsidian, amber, and marine shells, show distributions that can only be explained by repeated long-distance movement, foreshadowing later trade systems. A detail sharpens it. The consistent appearance of Anatolian obsidian in Levantine sites demonstrates that pathways of hundreds of kilometers were already in use before the rise of agriculture. The unresolved mystery remains whether such routes were sustained by specialized intermediaries or by collective seasonal gatherings. The planetary observation broadens the reflection as the Earth warmed. Human networks expanded alongside ecosystems, weaving together distant regions into webs that anticipated the structured trade of later millennia. To imagine this shift is to picture groups emerging from the shadow of glaciers into valleys green, with new growth carrying with them beads, blades, pigments, and knowledge. camps at river mouths and forest clearings became regular stops along routes where others would also pass. Objects changed hands, stories accumulated, and pathways lengthened until they spanned landscapes broader than ever before. In the rhythm of warming climates and swelling populations, the first global web began to take form, delicate yet enduring, a prelude to the trade routes that would one day circle the Earth. When the Ice Age came to an end, its networks did not vanish with the melting of glaciers or the drowning of shelves. Instead, they shifted, absorbed into new patterns shaped by warming climates, rising seas, and growing populations. The objects that once traveled as gifts along frozen rivers or exposed coasts became the seeds of traditions that endured into the Holocene, the age of agriculture and villages. What had begun as the passing of shell stones and pigments evolved into more formalized systems of exchange, and though the landscapes changed, the memory of connection persisted. Archaeology reveals continuity as well as transformation. The amber that moved southward from Baltic coasts, the obsidian from Anatolia, the shells from Mediterranean shores. These materials continued to circulate, their value deepened by the long history of symbolic exchange. In the Fertile Crescent, where early cultivation took root, obsidian tools remain prized evidence that networks established during the Ice Age still supplied materials across hundreds of kilometers. In Europe, the distribution of amber ornaments hints at roots that endured through the transition from foraging to farming. In Asia, the persistence of jade-like stones in symbolic contexts shows that the pattern of valuing distant materials carried forward into settled life. One lesser-known detail illustrates this endurance in the Levant Natufian burials, dating to the threshold of agriculture, contain marine shells from the Red Sea and the Mediterranean, showing that even as people began to settle, they still valued ornaments that traveled far. These shells are echoes of the Ice Age practice of carrying marine symbols inland, now woven into new cultural contexts. The unresolved mystery is how conscious this continuity was. Did communities remember the ancestral pathways that had carried goods across glaciers and shelves? Or did new generations simply inherit the habit of valuing distant materials without knowing the full extent of their origins? Was the persistence of exchange a deliberate honoring of tradition or an unconscious legacy of survival? Strategies embedded in culture. On the planetary scale, the story is one of expansion. As ice withdrew, ecosystems diversified. Grasslands gave way to forests. Rivers swelled with meltwater, and coastlines advanced inland. Humans filled these new habitats, their populations growing, their settlements lengthening into chains that stretched across valleys and plains. The networks of the Ice Age, once tenuous threads linking scattered camps, thickened into webs that bound emerging communities together. The scale of movement widened from hundreds to thousands of kilometers, foreshadowing the Silk Roads and maritime trade routes of later ages. A consensus fact underlines this. Archaeological evidence shows continuity in the circulation of valued materials, obsidian amber shells from the Ice Age into the Holocene, bridging the gap between forager networks and the trade systems of early farming societies. A detail sharpens it. Natufian burials with marine shells testify to the endurance of long-distance exchange, even as subsistence shifted. The unresolved mystery remains how deliberate this continuity was, whether people consciously sustained ancestral pathways or simply built upon habits of exchange that had already woven themselves into culture. The planetary observation expands the view. The first global trade networks were not inventions of civilizations, but legacies of Ice Age survival enduring into the age of villages and beyond. To imagine the close of this story is to picture the last Ice Age camps, their hearths flickering against the chill of retreating glaciers, and beside them, the ornaments, blades, and pigments that had already traveled far. In the centuries that followed, those same objects or their descendants in form and meaning would continue to pass from hand to hand, shaping the web of human connection that still binds the world. The Ice Age left behind not only reshaped continents, but also the template of exchange networks that began with gifts and ended as pathways, threads of survival and meaning that stretched across the Earth.